All right. Good afternoon. So welcome. My name is Sonia Laszlo. I'm an associate professor of economics at McGill University. I'm also currently the director of the Institute for the Study of International Development. So what we're doing here is we're kicking off a new series as part of a larger program that we have at the Institute on trying to help disseminate research on women's empowerment in developing countries. Very proud to announce that we, in partnership with IDRC, received a Short Connection grant in order to be able to do this. And what we are going to be doing today is the first of a series of research to practice types of seminars on women's empowerment in development. And so the idea with these seminars is that, as you probably very well know, the research on women's empowerment in development is accelerating at a very rapid speed, that there is just so much happening that it's hard to keep on top of. And so what we thought we would do is to, with a few specific selected topics, kind of focus in on some of the key issues that we are seeing coming out within the literature on what women's empowerment, how we measure it, and what some of the recent innovations in development policy and development planning have actually introduced, and what is the evidence, right? The evidence, as I said, is kicking up, very quickly. There's a lot of work that's being done, and so we thought it would be nice to be able to try to synthesize some of this most recent literature, put it into context to try to reach a broad audience, because of course, by the time this hits the textbooks, it's already going to be old news, right? But it's more than that. It's not just about this knowledge mobilization, but it's also about trying to integrate the perspectives from the worlds of practice and policy. And so in addition to, so the format that we're going to have for these seminars is that there's going to be, about a 45 to 50-minute talk by an academic. In this case today, it's going to be me talking about measurement. But then we're going to open it up with a very, very, very prestigious panel. We have IDRC, Ariane Dahan, we have François-Philippe Dubé from Global Affairs Canada, and we have Lindsay Mossman from the Aga Khan Foundation. And so the idea is that we, for each one of these seminars, once we've had a chance to think a little bit and see a little bit of what some of the evidence is, to then have the panelists reflect on some of the issues around that particular topic from the perspective of those of you who are actually doing the work in the field. So to have this sort of back and forth. And then we'll open it up to questions. So that's how we'll do it. What I'm going to do, however, now, I am going to be the first one to speak, and I'm going to move over to that computer. It's going to be a lot easier to move down the screens. So thank you. All right, great. So we thought that the perfect first talk of this series is women's economic empowerment, what we measure and why it matters. It's always good to sort of think about, okay, what is it that we're going to be talking about in this series of seminars? So what I'd like to do is to start with this motivation, which I'm sure is not new to any of you sitting in the room, nor is it new to anybody who's watching on Zoom. We know that there is a tremendous increase in global attention on women's economic empowerment, whether this is through, originally the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality, and of course we know that gender equality and women's empowerment and women's outcomes is very important in a number of other domains within the economy. It's important for economic growth. It's important for, the health and well-being and the human capital investment of children, and so on. In fact, as we know, especially here in Canada, that there's a very strong focus in international development policy making through Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. And as we're all very familiar with, is that there is, in addition to this acceleration in the research on women's economic empowerment, there's also an acceleration in development programming on these issues. And part of this is driven by the focus globally through the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals, but also here in Canada with the focus on the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So this whole topic of measurement first came to me very saliently when IDRC asked us to kind of take a look at some of the projects that IDRC has been funding through the GROW series, or possibly familiar with these GROW projects. These are projects that look at the growth in economic opportunities for women. And they asked us to, and they asked Kate, who's there, and myself, to review the 14 GROW projects, I think 40 or 50 countries overall, and to take a look at the papers that were being generated out of those research projects, and to see if we can find some sort of mapping of how researchers who've looked at these projects, who've worked on these projects, have actually measured women's economic empowerment. And so without looking at the papers, my prior was, no problem, we'll just stick a couple of students on this, and about a week or two later, we'll get some results. This is easy, right? Well, of course, it was a much more complicated endeavor to try to really wrap our heads around, how can we tell some sort of narrative about how people are measuring women's economic empowerment in these 14 projects, right? These 14 projects, great projects, but they're not representative of the huge mountain of research that's being done on women's economic empowerment. And so what we found in the 32 documents that we reviewed was that there were actually 40 different measures that were used to, speak to women's empowerment. So 14 projects, 32 papers, 40 measures, right? And what did we find? So I'm going to start with this. We found that by and large, the large majority of papers looked at some measure of women's labor market outcomes. Are they working? How many hours are they working? What kind of occupations are they working in? What's their wage? What's their salary, etc. Women's educational attainment as the second most popular. And then we start seeing things like women's autonomy and household decision-making, gender equality and social norms, gender equality in legal institutions. And then when we looked at this, we thought, okay, well, how representative is this of the larger literature? And so we wrote another paper, and we did a larger literature review, and we saw that, well, the numbers went up even more, right? There's really no consensus. One of the things that we walked away from this with is that there's really no consensus in terms of how people are measuring women's economic empowerment. So just as a heads up, I will not be finishing my presentation by saying, this is what you need to do. Okay, this is not the measure for measuring women's economic empowerment, right? That's not the message that you're going to hear from me, okay? There's not also going to be enough space in the time that I have, let alone the time that we have collectively today, to talk about all these different measures. So what I'm hoping to sort of set the stage here is how you want to think about the measurement exercise rather than what it is that you want to use, right? What's the measurement exercise? Now, this is all great, right? We're going to talk a lot about measurement, but before we measure something, it's a good idea that we're all on the same page about what it is that we're trying to measure, right? Well, empowerment in general, let alone women's empowerment or women's economic empowerment, it's a very abstract concept. It's a very complicated concept. And so it helps if we have some definition that we can work with. So Naila Kabir, in her 1999 piece, I think probably does, in my opinion, one of the best jobs of putting together a concept of women's empowerment. And I think it's a widely accepted definition of women's empowerment. Women's empowerment is about the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make strategic life choices acquire such an ability. Very importantly, in this same piece, which is about measurement, she gives us a lot of direction in terms of what kind of dimensions we might want to look at. The ability to exercise choice incorporates 3 interrelated dimensions: resources, defined broadly to include not only access, but also future claims to material and human and social resources. So resources first. Second, we have agency, which includes the processes of decision-making as well as measurable manifestations of agencies such as negotiation, deception, and manipulation, and achievements, well-being outcomes. Okay, so these are 3 big, parts. They kind of work in a chain. We have the resources, the agency, and the achievements. But of course, when we take a look at this, again, it's very complex. it's very abstract what these things mean. It's really, you know, we're probably, for each one of us in the room and watching this, we're probably already thinking about one natural possible measure for agency, another one for resources, and I bet you it's not all going to be the same around the room, right? Some of the big challenges here is that these are very normative questions, right? These aren't necessarily positive, easy things. Or think about something that might be a little bit more positive to measure: income, right? Income we can count. It's something that's already denominated in numbers. And so to quantify a concept like that, it's more natural to think about than to try to quantify something that is so normative. Okay? It's multidimensional. It can be abstract. And importantly, it's going to be very context specific. So before we go into thinking about approaches to measuring women's empowerment, I think there's a broader question that we always have to remember, right? Whether or not we're implementing a project or we're doing a research project and, you know, writing a thesis, is what's the purpose of measurement? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? So the first step, I think, is to, first of all, what is the situation? What is the lay of the land? Where are we at? And this is true for anything, whether it's women's empowerment or income or anything you want to measure, you know, the health and well-being of children. Then you want to use that data to then be able to design policies, right? And then from designing the policies, you need to implement the policies. And then once you've implemented the policies, you want to be able to evaluate the impact. Okay, and so what we have here is we have a sort of a logical framework with which we can progress, but it also indicates to us that we really need to start thinking about the measurement process from the very beginning. Well before we start designing policies, well before we start to implement policies, we already want to start thinking about the measurement exercise. A few general considerations for measurement is that there's a process in the way we're thinking about why it is that we need to measure these things, whatever it is that we're trying to measure, but there's also a process which we think drives what's underlining the changes that we're hoping to measure. Okay, so we need to have some sort of theory of change. So what's your research or policy question? In what way would the intervention that you're implementing or studying, would it change women's economic empowerment? What does the theory say? And what is the existing state of the evidence? A few considerations for measurement, and we're going to, you know, hopefully try to remember these because I'm going to come back to these in a few places. A few criteria that I think are very important, very practical. The first one is that your measure needs, whatever it is that you're trying to measure has to be observable, right? It has to be relevant and it has to be actionable. So what do we mean by these things? Observability. How easily can you collect the data? Right? So, you know, for looking at income, which is something that we do look at also in women's economic empowerment, can you observe it, right? Well, if you have a T4 slip, you can observe it, right? If you're working on the family farm and you're generating farm income, it's a little harder to observe. And this is something that is already countable, which is money, right? Relevance. How closely does it relate to what you want to measure? Okay, this is a little bit, you know, less obvious, but if you're trying to measure something like self-confidence or self-efficacy, right? Well, what kind of measure you're going to use may be very close to it or not that close to it. There's a measure of relevance. How connected to what it is that you're trying to measure? How related to agency is your measure really, you know, getting at? And then third, and this is a you know, definition that I'm actually taking from the Gates Foundation, is that it needs to be actionable. And for those of you in the room, in the audience who are more on the practice or implementation side, this probably resonates quite a bit to you, right? Measurement that has the potential to be acted upon or is designed with action in mind, okay? Because you want to be able to measure things so that you can then, you know, measure the success of, or not, of your implementation. A few other implementation considerations. Local context, in particular culture, matters quite a bit, right? So depending on which continent or which country, but even within countries, if it's across different ethnicities, languages, rural, urban, caste, right? The local context is going to matter quite a bit. The language, right? Whether it's French, English, Swahili, Spanish, right? That's going to matter. But there's also the small L language, right? How you ask the question, perhaps to respondents who might not necessarily have the cognitive ability or the cognitive skills because they haven't acquired as much education, et cetera, is also going to matter quite a bit. Survey fatigue. Right? I know, I see Teresa in the room. We've done quite a bit of work with collecting data from very large surveys. People get tired from answering questions, and you keep answering questions and answering questions. And in the end, it doesn't matter how well you've designed your survey or the survey question, you might not get the best data out of that. Yeah, okay, great. All right, so why is it important to get it right? I mean, there's, as you probably know, there's a lot of instruments. I mean, I told you there's a lot of instruments that we've seen just in the GROW research projects that have been put together through IDRC, through the broader literature. There are a lot of instruments. There's no shortages of ways to measure women's economic empowerment, right? So the question is, which one is the right one, and which one is the right one for you, and how do you actually implement that measure in the way that, and you want to get it right. Why do you want to get it right? Because if you don't get it right, you could very well misdiagnose the problem, right? I mean, think about a patient going to the doctor with a particular illness. The doctor's going to run a whole battery of tests, right? And try to then establish whether or not, okay, well, is blood pressure okay? Is, you know, weight and height and all of these things, are they all within acceptable parameters? If there's measurement error, right, the doctor can come up with a misdiagnosis. It's the same idea here, right? Oh, there's no gender inequality because everybody's answering the question the same way. Well, is that because you got the right instrument? Is it because you've asked the question right? Are the respondents just too tired and they're just telling you what you want to hear, right? I mean, there's a lot of these things that are going to be very important, because if you're going to then come up with policy recommendations or think about how to implement the policy or the intervention, if you've got the wrong data to begin with, it's going to, worse than not be useful. It could lead you in the wrong direction. From the perspective of those of us who like using this data to, you know, do some statistical analysis, well, we know very well the pitfalls of measurement error, right? So measurement error, depending on how you bring it in and within your statistical bias, could either lead you to estimate a zero effect when the effect is not zero, or worse, okay? It might actually not be able to predict anything one way or another. So let me start by an example. Well, this is one of my favorite examples. And so some of you have already heard this example in many ways. So imagine that you've got your survey, you're thinking about implementing some women's empowerment project, and you observe a woman at the beginning, at the baseline, she's not working, okay? And look, you know, I really want women, you know, this program to increase women's participation in the labor force, because we know that this is important because of many different reasons, right? Income matters. Also, if I'm working, perhaps I feel, you know, I'm contributing to society. It's meaningful in more ways than just me getting some income. And so imagine that at the end of my project, I measure her again and I see that she works. Awesome. Has this intervention actually empowered this woman? Right? So this is your intervention, right? It's not a black box, it's a blue box, right? So you want to think a little bit, first of all, well, what is it about her going from not working to working? Does she even want to work? There are days where I just have piles and piles of grading where I'm thinking, you know, I don't know if I want to keep working. Maybe it's time for me to retire, right? There are preferences, right? Perhaps she wants to work, perhaps she doesn't. Psychosocial, there might be psychosocial reasons. Maybe she's not sufficiently self-confident, right? And maybe this is somehow preventing her from acquiring the sorts of jobs that she wants. Maybe she has no autonomy, right? Maybe her spouse is just not letting her leave the house to go work. Gender norms. Perhaps she lives in a community where women are just not, it's frowned upon for a woman to work. Maybe she just doesn't have the education or the training to be able to get the types of jobs that she's interested in. Maybe there are no jobs in this market, right? So ultimately, which one of it is it that you're, you know, which one of these little factors is causing her to go from not working to working in your intervention? So what you want to think about is your intervention, first of all, responding to a theory of change that you have in mind? Why is it that she's not working, right? in your particular setting, is she not working because women didn't have access to education, and so you need to target the education? Is it issues around psychosocial issues, around self-efficacy, locus of control? Then there might be some interventions that you want to target there. So you want to think about the mechanism. You want to tailor your metric to that mechanism. And it might very well be that you want to use different instruments depending on the mechanism that you think matters. Okay. And then what does your context imply for measurement? So you might have, come down, this works, okay, this is fine. I'm doing this in Kenya, now I want to go to Nepal and I want to do the same thing. Can I use the same measures, right? Even if I think it's the same reason why women aren't working, and we can empower them by working, by providing this sort of thing, now the context is going to matter. All right, so coming back to this, so remember, we started off with, I introduced this by the work that I started doing with Kate and with IDRC, which shows that really, a lot of the large majority of papers that we looked at were looking at whether women's labor market opportunities, right? Are they working? So then, so here's this, we have these different mechanisms, we might have different theories of change, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these elements at play, right? So we need to think about what it is that our intervention is doing. Now, work, yes or no? Is this observable? Yes, it is, right? And this is one of the easiest things that you can ask in a survey. Are you working? Yes. Have you been working in the last 7 days? Yes. Have you been working in the last 12 months? On and off. Okay, it's a fairly easy question to ask, right? Is it relevant? Sure it is, right? Because it's, you know that women's empowerment is partly driven by, one of the achievements part of Kabir's work gives you an indication that, if she's willing to work, if she wants to work, and if she can work where she wasn't working before, she's probably more empowered. So it's relevant. Is it actionable? So we go from not working to working. Short of offering jobs, it's not clear how actionable just looking at that measure she's working really is. You might want to go back into those mechanisms, and that's where the action is going to be. How are you going to actually influence that change? Okay. Then the next question, this is something that I think those of us who've worked on in labor areas of women's empowerment have thought a lot about. Is work, yes, really what we want to measure in the end? Right? Is it working conditions, perhaps, right? Is it working in very unsanitary conditions? The best way to think about empowerment is working really crazy hours that you don't get a chance to see your kids, the sort of empowerment we have in mind. Is it job security, perhaps, right? Is it wages? Is it the hours? And is it work-life balance? Right? So even just something that's very measurable, very understandable, very common to use in this literature on women's empowerment is missing a lot of very important things that we can then relate back to what Naila Kabir had in mind when she was thinking about this notion of women's economic empowerment. So what I'd like to do is to delve in. I have a few slides here on the paper of measuring agency from, this is the World Bank paper that I think was circulated in advance. This is work by Donald et al., where they do a really very nice summary of some of the most recent advances in measuring agency. So I thought, let's get into this, because if we go back to some of these mechanisms here, you can imagine preferences, psychosocial autonomy, gender norms, a lot of that can come from agency, right? There's a large overlap between those concepts and agency. And in fact, psychosocial and autonomy are very much coming from that literature on agency. So what do we mean by agency? So again, going back to Kabir, this is the ability to define one's goals and to act on them. Amartya Sen, 1985, not thinking about women's empowerment specifically, but more broadly, the agency as freedom to achieve whatever the person as a responsible adult decides he or she should achieve. All right, and so their paper goes in and sort of breaks up agency into two pretty broad contexts. One is autonomy versus bargaining power, and this reflects the two disciplines that have contributed a lot to measurement of agency: psychology and economics, right? So in the psychology literature, there's a large, there's been a large sets of innovations of measures to try to get to autonomy, to try to get to a sense of how individuals' actions are regulated by oneself. Meanwhile, in the economics literature, we tend to think about agency as bargaining power, right? And so here, this is the ability to assert one's own preferences within a household decision-making setting. The big difference between the psychological literature and the economics literature, autonomy versus bargaining power, and I have it highlighted here, is that in bargaining power, it's really relational. It's my bargaining power within the household decision unit that I belong in, right? As opposed to just my own ability to act on my on what I want to do. So that's already a big difference between the two. So the paper goes through, and I'm just summarizing here and giving a few examples just to give you a sense and a flavor of the richness of the types of measures that exist to get at one dimension of empowerment, which is agency, right? And within that, they actually break it up into 3 categories within agency. We have a set of measures designed to try to get at whether or not people can define their own goals. What is it that they want, right? Kind of knowing your own preferences and your own autonomy. Then there's perceiving control and the ability to achieve goals. So one is knowing that you have a goal, right? Then the second one is, okay, well, can you do anything about that? And then the third one is, do you actually do something about it, which is acting on the goals. So the first one here is the Relative Autonomy Index. And you know, I won't go into much detail about it. You have it in the paper. I believe the paper is open access and you've got access to it. But for example here, it's constructed from answers to the following. My actions in whatever activity, livestock herding. My actions in livestock herding are partly because I will get in trouble with someone if I act differently, right? So I have to basically do what, this is very externally motivated. Second one here is regarding livestock herding. I do what I do so others don't think poorly of me. Again, there's an external dimension here. Or third, regarding livestock herding, I do what I do because I personally think it is the right thing to do. And that's more internally motivated. Okay, so external, coerced, introjected, and autonomous. And the way these sorts of measures work is that there are scores associated to this, a -3, a -2, a +3, and then you can aggregate this and you can come up with an index, right? What's the right number? Should it be -3? How do you weight these things? Why is the first one -3 and the other one -1 and the other one +3? Why not 0, 1, 2, 3? Okay. All right. The next example is goal setting questionnaire. So this is still within the defining goal. So there's a number of different ones here. I won't go through it all, but just to give you a sense, I understand exactly what I'm supposed to do in my job. I have specific clear goals to aim for in my job. So you answer these questions. It could be yes, no, right? Yes, no is fairly straightforward for a respondent to answer. Very often these are asked as Likert scales, which is like on a scale of 1 to 7, do you say that this is true or not true, right? Perceiving control and ability to achieve goals. All right, so locus of control, examples here is, imagine that, and this is just a sample of the types of locus of control measures that are being looked at. So you have to choose between A and B. So A is many of the unhappy things in people's lives are partly due to bad luck versus people's misfortunes result from the mistakes they make. You can see that there's an ownership over the outcome. And so to the extent to which you prefer A versus B, that tells you something different about your perceptions about how you're able to take control of things yourself. Okay. Self-efficacy, right? So this one, we talked a little bit about confidence earlier. This is kind of related. The question here is the attached form lists different activities. Rate how confident you are that you can do them as of now. Rate your degrees of confidence by recording a number from 0 to 100 using the scale below. Right? So 0 cannot do it all, 40 to 50 to 60 is moderately certain you can do, and then 100 is highly certain you can do. And so examples of activities are, you can stand up for yourself when you're feeling that you're being treated unfairly, or keep tough problems from getting you down, and so on. And you can come up with your own questions as well. And just to give a sense, again, it's not quite a Likert scale, it's a little longer than a Likert scale, but it's still, how confident are you from 0 to 100? Okay, this is where some of the local context might come in, right? Because trying to implement this in a setting where people are used to answering questions from 0 to 100, where they're used to a context where they're thinking in terms of 0 to 100% makes sense. But if you're dealing with a population, a sample, a region where there just isn't that sort of habit of thinking about things in those ways, it's going to be hard to really get something measurable here. And I've tried to do these sorts of scales, but without numbers. I tried to use like beans, or and you have these forms, and you have just put piles here. There are ways that you can try to get around it so that you're not using numbers, but it's not always that obvious to do in all settings. World Value Survey. So what's nice about the World Value Survey, and hopefully, I don't know if you've heard of it, but this is, very widespread. It's, there's now quite a few years worth of World Value Survey. And they have some very interesting questions, and this is more about the sense of agency, right? Some people feel they have completely free choice and control over their lives, while other people feel that what they do has no real effect on what happens to them. Using the following scale, again, another one of these scale questions, from 1 to, which means you have no freedom of choice and control at all, to 10, which is you have a great deal of freedom of choice and control. Please indicate how much freedom of choice and control you feel you have over the way your life turns out. Again, sense of agency. To what extent can you, could you potentially act on your goals? So again, so what's nice about this is one question, right? It has been asked in a very large cross section of countries, and then it's just the one question. All right. Acting on goals. All right, so you see even within the agency, there's also a theory of change. You see that there's a sequence, there's a logical sequence that follows the organization of these questions. Demographic and health surveys, very widespreadly used. In fact, I'm going to talk to you about one of the papers that I'm working on that uses this sort of data. And this is what we very often think about when we think about autonomy and or decision-making within households, right? So the types of questions that the DHS asks married women ages 15 to 49 on their decision-making role. So who normally or who usually makes decisions about X, right, in the following areas. So whether or not to use contraception, how the money you earn will be used, how your husband's or partner's incomes or earnings will be used, healthcare for respondents, major household purchases, visits to respondents, families or relatives. Okay, very widespreadly used, fairly easy to measure, right? I mean, I'll show you what the questionnaire looks like. It's an easy question relatively easy question to administer. The Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index, which I'm going to talk about fairly soon, does a little bit more with these sorts of decision-making variables, because if you go back to this, so who decides on how much money, on how to spend your money? Well, it could be my husband, but maybe it's because I just don't want to deal with the finances. Maybe I just feel more comfortable leaving that to somebody else in the house. And maybe it's just because I just don't like numbers. I don't want to think about it, right? So there's this issue of, well, if she answers yes or no, is she empowered, yes or no? Well, that's going to depend on really, does she want to be involved in that decision-making framework? And so the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index has tried to incorporate that dimension within these decision-making instruments, right? So for different agricultural activities, they focus more on, especially with the older version of the WEA, focus more on the agriculture side of things. Did you participate, and how much input did you have, are the sorts of questions that they're asking within that. And then, to the extent that you feel like you can make your own personal decisions regarding these aspects of household life, if you wanted to, right? And I think that that's really important to really bring it back down, is sort of not you should be taking these decisions, but are these decisions you want to be taking, is a very different way of looking at that particular issue. So how do these measures stand up to some of the criteria that we were talking about earlier? Is it observable, relevant, and actionable? Observable, it is, right? You can do household and individual surveys, but bear in mind that they can be expensive, they can be time consuming. You're gonna have to adapt to local context so that it's understandable in the language big L and the language small l. Is it relevant? Sure it is. right? You can, come up with, go to economics, go to psychology, you'll find a number of models that'll tell you why these things are important and how. Are they actionable? Well, to some extent, some of these things might be actionable. You can think about certain interventions that can target self-efficacy. You can think about, thinking, trying to work with women and men to think about how to share in decision making if this is what they jointly decide to do, right? There are things that you can action on that perspective. Very quickly, Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index. I believe that we circulated also the more recent one, so that goes in a lot more detail. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here. But just to, so what this is doing is it's, the goal here was to track changes to women's economic empowerment within the agriculture project. This was the origin back when they brought this in through IFPRI. What's nice about the women's empowerment in agriculture is it's very multidimensional. So it's stepping outside of just looking at agency and trying to incorporate more of these other dimensions, right? It's trying to incorporate resources, it's trying to incorporate achievements. It's also very nice because it allows you to decompose into different indices. So, is a woman empowered from the perspective of resources? Is she empowered from the perspective of agency? Is she empowered from the perspective of achievements? However, it does require definitions, thresholds, weights, and how you select these things can sometimes be an art as well, right? And of course, it's a very long questionnaire. Now, the original WEA had 5 domains: production, resources, income, leadership, and time. Right, different indicators for the different areas or the different domains, and they're all assigned with different weights. Recognizing a number of limitations in the early versions of the WEA, IFPRI has designed a number of modifications to the instrument. In particular, they have this more recent Pro-WEA, which is looking at things a little, they're really focused, relabeling things in terms of agency, intrinsic agency, instrumental agency, collective agency. And they've added a number of things, which is where this little hand symbol goes, that were missing in the original version. So self-efficacy, attitudes towards domestic violence, which we haven't really seen much up until then in these big measures, visiting important locations, membership in influential groups, etc. So thinking again about, the implementation considerations, you can imagine that when you're dealing with these large indices with all of these different dimensions, you can imagine that given the local context, given the local language, given the, the social context, the cultural context, you might need to redefine how you measure these things. You may need to redefine the weights that you assign, right? You may need to redefine the thresholds. So this is from the DHS. So this is these, autonomy or decision-making within the household variables. This is just a screenshot from the actual questionnaire, and don't worry about reading it. It's not meant to be read, right? But it's just to give you a sense of relatively how easy it is to actually ask these questions, right? You ask a question like, who usually decides how the money you will earn will be used? You, your husband, partner, you and your husband partner jointly. Sometimes maybe it's your mother, mother-in-law, etc. Right? So you just circle that number and you move on. You can look at each of these measures independently. They're typically very easy to administer. Now you have to maybe have 6 or 7 of these. You have to think about how you want to collapse this into. Do you want to collapse this into an index? Do you want to look at them all individually? How do you aggregate that? How do you weight them? Which components do you use? Maybe some of them are completely irrelevant in the context that you're working in. Okay. And so here, some of the things that have come up in using this sort of measure is the large differences across cultures, right? My understanding is that these DHS measures for decision-making were very much designed originally for South Asian context, right? You introduce this in Latin America, right? And there's this, you see that all of a sudden you move the same instrument to Latin America, and all of a sudden you see that Latin American women are incredibly empowered compared to their South Asian counterparts, right? Well, it might be true, but it could also be because of this phenomenon of supermoms, right? the women are already doing pretty much everything in a lot of these households in Latin America, right? So are they really empowered, or is it, you know, maybe they'd like to relinquish a little bit of some of these tasks, like, I don't know, some of these purchases and meals, and so, you know, actually the IDRC has this, Susana Martinez Restrepo has a book that IDRC has that really goes into and delves into some of these issues about how these autonomy and decision-making variables just don't really work very well in Latin America. There are large differences on, of course, whether or not you ask men or women. The World Bank study that we shared shows, even using the DHS, these same measures, if you ask the man or the woman who makes the decision, you get drastically different answers. And so whose answer you use in your analysis is going to be very important. And maybe you actually want to look at both, right? Maybe it's not just hers, but it's his as well. And maybe the difference between the two is something else that should be interesting to look at. And then correlations across domains, right? If I'm empowered, if I'm making decisions on health and education, does it make, you know, should that correlate with the other dimensions? Maybe, maybe not. Why should it? These are questions we need to sort of flesh out. And so still within this context of household bargaining and bargaining power and decision-making, there's a couple of studies I want to talk to you briefly about in the world of contraceptive choice. And there's this one study in particular by Nava Ashraf and her colleagues, perhaps you're familiar with it, in Zambia, where what they do is they say, look, we really want to empower women to be able to take control over their reproductive health, right, their reproductive lives. There's excess fertility in this community, and so maybe if we provide them with vouchers for free and accessible birth control, this is going to help them to, you know, reduce their excess fertility. So they did a randomized controlled trial. They randomized who got the voucher and who didn't, but more interestingly, they randomized whether or not the respondent received the voucher in the presence of her spouse or not, right? And so what they found was that women who were more likely to choose concealable forms of birth control if there was spousal discordance in the ideal number of children. So he wants more children than her. She's more likely to then conceal the fact that she's using birth control when she's given the voucher in the absence of her spouse, right? So to me, this study says a whole lot about empowerment. They do not measure empowerment, right, in this paper. So I've actually been working on a project in Peru on conditional cash transfers, looking at the impact of conditional cash transfer on women's empowerment and fertility decisions and contraceptive use. We find the same thing. We find that women do conceal the use of birth control from their spouses. In fact, we find that the conditional cash transfer increases the probability that she conceals the use of birth control when her spouse is preferring a larger family than she does. But that effect completely disappears when we use the DHS type of measure. We're using the DHS, but when we use the DHS measure on who makes a decision about birth control, we don't find that result, but they're still hiding it, right? So that just goes to show that sometimes, you know, the direct measure for empowerment doesn't necessarily always capture everything that you might not be able to find in other dimensions. So what do these examples tell us? They tell us that how you frame the question matters, that the framing may be based on the context, language, culture, domain, how you ask the question matters, in particular, who else is in the room, and that the empirical results may actually not be robust to the measure that you use. Right, which you're probably thinking, oh boy, this is going to complicate my PhD thesis, right? Or it's going to complicate my impact assessment. On the other hand, it might also be saying, okay, well, maybe we need to look at a lot more than just the one, you know, the one measure. Going back to this achievement, just before wrapping up, you know, so we want to, so what are achievements? So we talked about agency. We didn't really talk much about resources, but let's talk a little bit more about achievements, because I want to come back to this this notion here. So if you remember, you know, so we had this intervention. We went from not working to working. I should have explained some of the icons, right? You know, whether she's working as a doctor, or she's working as an entrepreneur, or she's working as a teacher wearing pants. By the way, I just couldn't find a female version of that icon, but she's wearing pants. All right, so theory of change. Okay, so remember what it is that we're trying to do here. So you know, the work is an outcome, it's an achievement. She's working, great. Okay, is she empowered? Why do you think that she wasn't working to begin with? Why would your intervention, what does your intervention do to try to solve this? And then how is the outcome related to empowerment? How is working now related to empowerment? So that's the first thing, theory of change. Second, how do you tailor the metric to the theory of change, right? Research, you look for existing measures, adapt for the local context, prototype. We didn't talk about this, right? But using just the one survey instrument that your theory says, okay, this should, locus of control, there's this paper in psychology, that's great. Okay, this really maps really well into my theory. Now what do I do with this? I put it in my survey and I send my field staff to run the surveys. Sure, but you might want to pre-test it and then test it and then retest it. And unfortunately, humans don't always test in the same way the more often you do the question, right? So there's a large literature on that, but this is something, especially the more complex the instrument is, the more it demands some cognitive skill to sort of wrap your head around what it is that it's doing. You may want to think about dedicating additional resources to doing that. So here's another example from one of the GROW projects that I've been very fortunate to be a part of, which is a randomized controlled trial on subsidizing childcare in Kenya. And so here we had a very clear theory. The theory was, we think that women in the slum of Nairobi called Korogocho aren't working because they don't have access to good quality childcare. Right? So they have their kids all the time and it's difficult for them to be able to work. So that was our theory. Our intervention was a randomized controlled trial on providing subsidized and quality childcare. What did we measure? Labor market outcomes. Is she working? How many hours is she working? Where is she working? How often is she working? We measured, who makes decisions over XYZ in your household. So the standard types of autonomy or decision-making model, DHS type of things. What did we find? We found huge results in terms of employment, increased labor force participation rates by a lot, right? Almost enough to narrow the gender gap, the national level gender gap, huge. For women who were working, we saw that they reduced the number of hours worked. Is that a bad thing? Could be, maybe not. If she's already working 60 to 80 to 100 hours, maybe reducing the number of hours to 40 is actually the more empowering thing. Right? Interestingly enough, nothing came out in our autonomy measures. So again, right? I mean, it's tricky. I am running out of time, so I'm going to have to, the JPAL paper I really highly recommend those of you who are interested in implementing measurements to really take a look at this paper. They provide some, a lot of excellent resources in terms of the existing measures out there for measuring women's empowerment in the different domains. What I particularly do encourage you to take a look at are the non-survey based questions that they have. They have some nice examples with vignettes and experiments about how you can get to the same issues, but perhaps in ways that are more meaningful in terms of data collection than just through survey question. So where do we go from here? So take a look at, so again, I hate to say, just take a look at what JPAL is doing, but really this is a really fantastic resource for anybody who's working on this. And this is important here. The first box in their paper says developing a measurement strategy. And again, this is something that needs to be started at the very beginning of a project, a research project or intervention project. Conduct formative research to understand gender and empowerment of the specific context, right? So this might be looking at the quantitative data, but it's probably looking a lot at qualitative evidence as well, right? Focus groups, talking to people, stakeholders. Step 2 is to map a theory of change and use it to select appropriate outcomes and indicators, right? So again, going back to some of what I was saying earlier, develop and validate data collection instruments that minimize reporting bias. Okay, so this is the sharpening of the tools, right? And then design a data collection plan that minimizes measurement error. Okay, so again, these are things that need to start from the beginning, not ex post, right? Right from the start. So where do we go from here? Right? Always think about what that theory of change is. What is the purpose for measurement? What is the research question or what is the intervention? to try to build in that measurement strategy from the very start. What lessons to take from the evidence that already exists and incorporate that within your management your measurement strategy. And the one thing that is always very difficult to take away, especially when discussing with donors and government agencies, is that there is no one shoe fits all for these sorts of measures. And I think this is my last slide. Asking the right question, right? So do we want women to work? Sure, that's an interesting question, but maybe the more interesting question is, well, why are they not working, and how can we empower them in a way that work is meaningful for them, right? Might be the better question. What is the underlying theory? Again, coming back to this notion of tailoring the metric to the problem at hand versus, there's a balance. You got to balance between, okay, I need to answer this question specifically, but at the same time, my donor wants to know, did I empower women overall? Yes or no, right? So there's a trade-off there to deal with. Is it observable? Is it relevant? Is it actionable? I think those are three characteristics that I like to think about quite a bit. Pre-test, test, and then retest. And then finally, there's always this, can eat up probably a large, if not disproportionately large amount of thinking power for any project, is how you implement these things within the local context. And that is it. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn to the panel. First, I'd like to introduce my panel. I'm very, very pleased with the people who've accepted our invitation to speak. Lindsay Mossman, Senior Gender Equality Advisor at the Aga Khan Foundation Canada, providing strategic guidance on gender equality analysis and integration in programming and operations. She holds a Master of Arts in International Affairs and from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Lindsay is a gender specialist with 15 years experience, including conducting gender analysis, assessments, and integration coaching for individuals and organizations. François-Philippe Dubé is policy analyst at Global Affairs Canada, where he develops policies and guidance on inclusive growth, women's economic empowerment, and financial inclusion. Previously, he worked as team leader for Canada's Economic Development Program in Mozambique and Development Project Officer in Mali. He holds an MA in International Relations from the Université de Québec à Montréal. Aryan Dahan is Director of IDRC's Inclusive Economies Program. He leads a multidisciplinary team that strengthens policy research capacity in developing countries on issues of economic policy, governance, and health systems. He previously led IDRC's programming on poverty reduction, employment, growth, and gender equality, including the Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women program. Before joining IDRC, Aryan was Social Development Advisor at the UK's Department for International Development for 10 years. Aryan holds a PhD in Social History from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So please welcome me in joining this very distinguished panel, and we have prepared some tough questions for them. So the first question, and we're going to start with François-Philippe, but then we'll invite Lindsay and Aryan to also discuss, is in thinking about the work you do or your organization does in the area of women's economic empowerment. What are the top 3 criteria you use for selecting what measures you use and why?
Thank you very much, Sonia. This is a complicated question for us as we are a donor. So I'd like to bring up 2 elements of context here. First, it's about Global Affairs Canada's approach to women's economic empowerment. Just to say that in 2013, we released a guidance note that was quite progressive, actually, on women's economic empowerment. That was focused on mostly on the sectors of intervention that are relevant in supporting women's economic empowerment. However, it didn't have much to say on the measure of WE. And then after that, we found that in spite of the guidance note, most projects funded by Global Affairs Canada have sought to support women's economic empowerment through the promotion of women-owned enterprises, often formal, with some exceptions. So this is the majority of our WE-related projects. Another element of context is about GAC's RBM approach to WE. Until now, Global Affairs Canada has not sought to make RBM uniform across WE projects. At project level, indicators generally come from our partners, from our implementing partners. And they are, however, what we have sought to do is to try, where possible, to aggregate them. When we see that, partners use similar indicators to measure the same dimension, for example, we try to see whether it's possible to put them on the same basis so that at least we can aggregate them and report on them. All this to say that among the top criteria that we use for WE indicators, I mean, they're not different in this case than what we use for any other indicators. We ask that they be SMART. That is, that they be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and related to a target. And when possible, as I was saying, we prefer indicators that can be aggregated. This said, when we look at the indicators that we actually use to measure WE across our projects, two characteristics emerge. First, they tend to equate women's economic empowerment with the financial betterment of women-owned enterprises. So this is an issue in the sense that they allow the use of they tend to use business records as a primary data source to measure women's economic empowerment. They don't really use statistically valid surveys. I say that that's the general tendency, but there are exceptions. Second, they also tend to skirt around the conflictual nature of power. For example, they will seek to assess how much women succeed on the marketplace, but they don't necessarily investigate issues such as intra-household dynamics, bargaining power, that decision-making power, that kind of issues. So those are the grand tendencies that we noticed.
Great. Lindsay, did you want to weigh in?
Great, thank you very much. So this is a really interesting question because as an organization that delivers programs on women's economic empowerment, we're often trying to determine not only which interventions to use, depending on the theory of change, but also how to measure those and to know that we're making progress, and also to ensure that we are not increasing risk, or that we are not, or that we are preventing things like resistance or backlash, particularly in the communities and areas in which we work, which are geographically usually very remote and rural, and often quite conservative in terms of gender equality. And so it's really important that we not only use interventions that are appropriate, but that we also are actually measuring progress that can be quite incremental, and that we are also being careful to ensure that our interventions aren't actually resulting in harm. So there's a number of things that we consider. We tend to use some standard approaches across our women's economic empowerment programs. That may not result in standard indicators, but the standard criteria that we look at really is around access and control over resources or assets and decision-making. Usually decision-making at the household level and decision-making at the community level, depending on the types of interventions. So we certainly also tend to prefer, or at least as a gender specialist, I tend to prefer use of qualitative measurements and qualitative methods. And I think that gets back to, Sonia, one of the issues that you've raised is around how do we actually know that what we're measuring or the information we're getting from the tools that we use are telling us what we think they're telling us. And so we try to, as much as possible, validate the information through multiple sources and also through multiple methods. And in particular, we found that the use of qualitative methods has been much more effective at helping us get at the nuance. It's not as easy to report on in terms of reporting to a donor about progress or evaluating your program, but it's certainly much richer in terms of actually giving us the information that we need to program. So the other elements will depend on the sector. For certainly, if we're looking at agricultural production, or if we're looking at entrepreneurship, or if we're looking at technical vocational training or other elements. And then the other thing I would say is that you know, it certainly also depends on the kinds of, you know, the length of the program, the context of the program, and also the budget of how much is possible. So there's a number of different kinds of ways we choose what kinds of measurements to use and what kinds of methods we're going to use.
Great, thank you. Arian.
Thanks very much. So we look at this as IDRC. We support research for development, and we support the capacity to do good research. I'll come to the capacity in one of the later questions. And before I kind of specify how we make those choices, I first want to go back to the GROW experience that you talked about, because this is very interesting, and this shows how we are learning too. When we started the GROW program, we thought we had a very clear, tight definition of women's economic empowerment, and you saw it, and it was a variant of the Naila Kabir definition as was formulated by the OECD, and we thought it was very tight. And guess what? 4 years later, the team then looked at how many definitions that led to. It was 40, and it was going to cost my job. As like you were supposed to lead a program that had a specific theme, and you couldn't even figure out what the definition was. We came out of that very well, and it was a very important learning experience. But there is some inevitability in this, and I think what you all have spoken to illustrate that. We found in the end, you said, and we completely agree to that, the diversity that came out of that was entirely valid, as in each researcher chose particular definition depending on what he was interested in that particular context. So in the end, after that we figured out in a way how this worked, and we. I think you refer to smart indicators. We're not that smart. We have I think of it as being red, and the red is first the measure needs to be right. It needs to be measured rigorously. Right in the sense of it needs to speak to what you're interested in. There's qualitative or quantitative, direct and indirect. Very important differences. They are all there. When you're interested in a particular problem, you need to make sure that the measure is appropriate to that. The second one is then it needs to be embedded. I think what you called context. All those questions inevitably, not just globally, but if you measure this in central here in Ottawa, in Nepean, I can imagine that you would get different answers as well. So it needs to be the same questions that need to be embedded, and finally they need to let's say drive change. They need to be useful for what it is that you want. If you are in an intervention or you support women's organization, the measures need to be appropriate for what those groups of those interventions try to achieve. And very importantly, you need to do all three at the same time. And we'll come to trade-offs later.
Great. Excellent. Our second question, have you faced, and we're going to address this first to Lindsay, have you faced the trade-off between the need for generalizability and the need for specificity in selecting measures of women's economic empowerment for monitoring and evaluation? And if so, how have you resolved the trade-off?
Yes, is the quick answer. So the challenge is, as I think I mentioned before, trying to trade off between seeing trends in the overall picture and then also trying to understand what's really happening within a particular context or within a particular project or even within a particular region within that project. And so, you know, we both need to be able to report, and we often use an aggregate of an indicator to report on how we're doing in terms of a particular element of empowerment or a particular element of a program. And then the detailed information will be actually used for determining how to move forward in that program, or where changes need to be made, or what specific interventions need to be adjusted. The other thing is that in some of our indicators, within the indicator, for example, if we look at access to or control over assets, we may weight the assets within that indicator. And so the indicator itself might be standalone, but within it, which assets are more important? will depend on the context. And so we'll actually determine which assets we want to look at with our local team based on the context, and then also which ones are more important, or which ones would indicate higher levels of empowerment. So for example, in a women's empowerment program in Afghanistan, we look at, for example, everything from computer, mobile phone, jewelry, generator, radio, and actually having access and control over a generator, and those are different things, would be a much higher level of empowerment, for example, or would indicate much more decision-making control and control over resources in that context. So that's quite interesting for us.
Take the next. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yes. Yeah, very similar. When I read the question, first of all, I thought like I was going to say yes and no, and then I realized that probably means yes, there must be trade-offs then, right? And I think they are really important. The trade-offs are really important to consider. What I said before is like you need to do, and I still stick with that. You need to do look at the rigor, the use, and the context at the same time, and you do. But there are trade-offs in what you do there. They're very important to consider, I would say, because we do have an incredibly powerful framework on the SDGs, on the Sustainable Development Goals that mobilizes the international community to do the right things, including on SDG 5, of course. And our work also needs to link to and contribute to those SDGs and how they are measured, right? Within SDG 5 or 8, whichever it was. The one on work and labor, I think, is really bad. And everything you said in your presentation makes me think, yeah, that's part of the SDGs that where we haven't got it right. But we can't. But we still need to work with them. So you need to build those linkages. Where there's trade-offs as well, I think, is in the one of the perhaps a bit jargony, but thinking about the intersectionality is that this discrimination or disparities are not alone along the lines of gender, but they intersect with race, class, and caste, and age, disability, and so on, and that makes it much harder, and hence there are more and more trade-offs. So we need to consider, we need to take those trade-offs very, very, very seriously, and the one thing but it's more, again, coming back to the diversity of projects that we have, the way we then, after that diversity has emerged, the way I think about this is we need to find a way, and this of synthesizing. This is not summarizing, but synthesizing what you have. That you need to find a way. I think of it as benchmarking those context-specific measures against the generalizable. And that's not easy to do. You have to craft that narrative, but it is very important to do.
The short answer for Global Affairs Canada is that the trade-off has always been resolved in favor of specificity, just by virtue of the fact that we don't have strong guidance on how to measure. We receive whatever indicators our implementing partners propose. There's one exception, certainly, that there might be more, but there's one exception with Soko Devi, for example, which has been implementing a version of their own version of the WEA, and has been implementing it, essentially delivering a core set of questions across 5 countries, Honduras, Bolivia, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Ghana, in 3 different projects in different sectors. And I think that through this type of methods, I would say, they have been able to gather quite a few interesting. They have been able to gather interesting data, but of course, it goes to show that our partners have much richer data sets than what we receive, essentially.
Okay, great, thanks. So the third question, we're going to start with Ariane, is what tools or approaches does your organization use to measure progress on WE in your programs or policies?
Right, thank you. This directly follows from the previous part of the discussion, and I think what for us is very important is how we link specific measures to broader understanding of women's economic empowerment. Our goal is gender equality in the Kabir sense, but very important. And what IDRC wants to do is promote what we call gender not just we you know, with others, what we call gender transformative research that takes that broad understanding and how women define what is men and women define what is important in changing gender relations as a starting point. And these are necessarily very broad, and necessary, and it's also the case that research can't do all of the above at the same time. The important part there is, again, take those trade-offs very, very serious, is to think about the specific interventions and the specific measures, how they, and it might be very limited and quantified measures, these might be very important, but how do these contribute to the broader change? You can't do everything at the same time, so think about the specifics that contribute to that. So how, what we, in our terminology, how are these embedded in pathways of change in that change that you want to achieve? And the final thing I want to say in terms of how we do it, how we support that, as I said before, IDRC supports capacity for doing good research. For us, it is very important that we work with a community of researchers across the global South to help to build up the capacity to do this research in this way.
Sure. Thanks. So we use a number of tools and a number of approaches, and I should say that I work very closely in partnership with our monitoring and evaluation research and learning team at Aga Khan Foundation, but also with the Women's Economic Empowerment Community of Practice here in Canada. And so, you know, we've been talking about definitions, theories of change, measurement, what works, what doesn't work. And so, you know, this is a group of Canadian NGOs primarily who come together and talk about these things. So I've also asked them to share some of their thoughts. And, you know, in terms of tools and approaches, you know, we certainly use the ICRW approach in terms of sort of agency, structure, relations, which is also very much aligned with care. As well as the Women's Empowerment and Market Systems approach. So we use a number of different sort of frameworks. And then certainly in terms of measurement, we use the DHS and we also use the WEAI fairly consistently depending on what we need. And so we pull from different places and put things together depending on the program. I should also note one thing that CARE's been doing that's really interesting is exploring how beneficiaries themselves define women's empowerment and how that actually looks in their context. And that can be very specific to a context, and it usually has nothing to do with the nice theories that we have and everything to do with their day-to-day lives. And so talking with women in particular about what is empowerment in your context and what would it look like? And then how do we get there? And then we measure that. And so that is very different from some of these other statistically validated tools or internationally validated tools, but it's quite meaningful. And so there's a number of different methods like that organizations are piloting that I think could be very rich as well to add to the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, so what tools do we use to measure well? At the risk of repeating myself, so again, at the moment we really measure it on a project by project basis according to the terms that the measurement indicators that our implementing agencies have proposed us. As I was saying, we know that our partners very often tend to have much more robust data than when they send us. In the future, we're exploring at the moment 2 ideas, and it's, you know, they remain to be implemented, but 2 possibilities. One would be to have a policy evaluation framework that would essentially tell in advance to partners the type of questions that we would be interested in in looking into the type of issues we're interested in looking into with respect to women's economic empowerment, and also maybe a list of generic indicators that could help our partners align their own indicators to that could help them to align their own indicators, so that we could essentially better investigate issues of the related to norms, agency, resilience, etc. The question of the WEA remains. This is something that is interesting, but again, we don't have much experience with it, so it's I think that we have to have some sort of conversation with our partners at some point to better understand the extent to which this tool is used and what's its potential and its limit, what their limitations are. So that's it.
Excellent. Well, this leads us very nicely, I think, to our last question, which is clearly self-interested from the perspective of sort of academia. We are very interested now in knowing what directions you would like academic research, perhaps, to push on women's economic empowerment and how to measure it. Where do you think the gaps are? Maybe we'll start with that. I don't know, Lindsay, did you want to start that? Or no?
Great. So, I mean, many things. Certainly in terms of research, I think for women's economic empowerment work, a stronger focus on social norms change and addressing gendered barriers to economic empowerment, whether those barriers are at the household level or within the labor market or in the broader context. I think that would be quite useful. Certainly looking at measurement of reproductive labor and how, not only how we value that, but also how it's offset by engagement in more productive work, and whether that is really labor that's just being transitioned either to other unpaid workers or to poorly paid, usually female workers. That's something that Oxfam has been focusing on a lot. And so certainly around, recognition of unpaid work and how do we actually have that burden shared more equitably in the household among women and men in particular. And then certainly looking at gender analysis for women's economic empowerment programming. So in terms of formative research, how are we designing formative research to address all the various domains of women's economic empowerment that would then help us to better design our programs and then also measure them. So stronger, guidance for the design of women's economic empowerment programs through clearer frameworks for gender analysis for those programs.
I was just thinking how brave it was of you to ask this question, because the last time we thought we had a simple question. I think we overexploited a cohort of about 6-7 people at McGill for about 2 years. So be careful what you ask for. But the work has been great. I want to say thank you for all that work and how important this is for the development community. I think that that there's many things. One thing I would absolutely highlight: continue to explore that diversity and ways of bringing it together. Don't get discouraged by the people ask, like, give me a simple measure. Give them a simple measure, but put it in the broader theory of change. So continuously exploring that diversity is absolutely important. Secondly, as I said before, I think it's very, very important to continue to engage with the Sustainable Development Goals, because that is a common framework that we have, and there's many gaps in there. I mentioned the indicators on employment there that I need much improvement. And indeed, as Vince, as you're saying, it's like the unpaid work in that is absolutely key. There's really big gaps, and that's not because people don't want to address it, but there's a real research agenda there to help do that better. The other thing I would say is in that make sure that again, reflecting that diversity leads to a need for multidisciplinary research. It needs to be qualitative and quantitative. It needs to be direct and indirect. All these things are important. So logically, it is not almost logically. I believe, I strongly believe it is multidisciplinary research where you want to draw. And again, that's something that what you've been doing very well at McGill. And finally, and I said it before, and make sure that the measures are relevant for the change that you want to see. That doesn't mean you trade off against rigor. Rigor remains important, but the choices that you made, I think for me are informed by the certain changes we want to see. You make that instrumental to that. But thank you so much again.
I should also just clarify that part of it isn't necessarily self-interested from the McGill part, but I know we have some students in the room and in the audience, so they're very eager to hear these things. So thanks.
No, I just want to say it'll be a lot of work. Don't forget.
For my part, I'd like to go in a different direction. Actually, we donors are much simpler than academics or implementing agencies. We would like things to remain simple. Actually, what would be absolutely what would be useful, I believe, is I would say that I would like to see academics trying to translate their theories of change, for example, into the models that are actually used by donors, not by IDRC, because IDRC has its own model, but all of the others, we use something that's related to a logic framework, to a logic model, using an ultimate outcome with a change of being in well-being, with an intermediate outcomes that refer to changes in performance, with immediate outcomes that refer to changes in capacity. That kind of very simple model that are used by most developing agencies, I believe. That would be useful. That would go a long way in ensuring that whatever is proposed is adopted by the community of donors, and then that we can easily, try to get to some uniformization of results-based management processes for different projects in WED. Also, because there's a lot of money that goes into monitoring and evaluation, lesson learning, but still monitoring and evaluation. Generally they would follow more or less these. Certainly, on the donor side, they would follow these frameworks. So it's just a different way of casting reality, but it's one that would be more useful for us. At the same time, for measurement as such, for indicators, what would be useful is that they be better, indicators be better matched with the corresponding level of results that of what they measure. To what extent is a change of income a result, an intermediate level result, or is it an ultimate outcome level result? It's rather important, actually, because then it means that from that you decide whether it's related to the question of whether earning more money is actually a proof that your project that your report project succeeded, or is it just one component of the well-being of your ultimate beneficiary? So those are questions are really fundamental, but I don't see them addressed. That's it.
Thank you for answering very challenging questions, and in doing so, opening up a whole bunch of other questions. So maybe I'll just see if the panelists want to reflect or respond to anything that they've heard throughout the panel, and then we can open it up.
Just to respond to this last comment, I mean, I think from a program perspective, we're certainly always looking for standard elements, and then obviously having to make context specific or other very specific interventions or approaches. And so I think, having some guidance around core elements, which exist across a number of different frameworks and are sometimes presented in different ways is quite useful as long as there's flexibility to then adapt that, right? And so that's why a tool like the WEAI has been quite useful for us, but certainly there are other tools and approaches. And I think that's something I would put to the sector, is that it really is for us to start to also identifying what are those core elements that we agree on as much as possible. And then from there, you know, the other elements that are maybe good practice, or the other things that we can consider, or the other dimensions that we would like to look at. So that's something that I think at the community of practice that we're also looking at. We haven't had any consensus necessarily, although I think we've sort of come to agree that, you know, that certainly the economic indications of improvement are very important, but they have to go hand in hand with changes in gender equality and empowerment, you know, in terms of social empowerment and individual empowerment, in order for it to really be a women's economic empowerment program. There may be others who don't share that view in the community of practice, but that's sort of the discussions that we've had.
Yeah, really excellent. Thank you so much. My name is Serge Eric Yaku. I'm working as an international evaluators, then currently with the Global Affairs in South Sudan, and also with the UNICEF in Burkina Faso. And then I was very happy to see all of you mentioned, you know, the overall concern about the area of empowerment. And then most of the times we forgot to look at the maybe 3 or 4 said for what women need. As one party member said, that it's better to let women ask when they need, so that we can act from there. This should be most of times by the lessons, the best practice. And I mean, like in the baseline phase, we focus on what the women need, and then we design the interventions. And then, but sometimes I didn't see anyone mention something about the culture. As you know, most of the intervention I do in the global South, culture is very, very key. Like in Asia, was in Philippines or in South Sudan 2 months ago. And then people, or mostly women, sometimes they pay attention to the culture, so that, as you said in your presentations, some women may just slow down the number of hours of working, but not because she needs more money or she lacks money, but mostly because she's looking mostly to the relationship to one cultural setting with the women. So that if she's not part of this group, she feel like she's not really happening. So the happiness of those women sometimes didn't depend mostly on income, more depend on maybe how big as the economic power has been increased, but more sometimes about the interrelationship with other set of women's regions groups, and then focus like in South Sudan. So I wonder what, based on you also this kind of example into your example either the GAC or IDRC, because the global South now is becoming more important than to be considered in the design of human intervention. Thank you.
IDRC, were
Well,
specific targets for that question?
no. Well, I would have just a general comment on this. Is that of course a project should come with a good gender-based analysis that would normally ask these questions. In global affairs, we do care as I mean, normally we ask that our proponents ask the questions directly to the beneficiaries. These questions directly to the beneficiaries of the interventions. Normally, they should be they should be consulted regarding the intervention. So it's a good point, it's a fair point, and maybe it's something that we can more systematically ask as to how, you know, getting more details about how people were consulted and how the goals of the intervention were designed.
Yeah, so as an implementer, I think it's really important, absolutely, that the beneficiaries, the ultimate beneficiaries are key, not only consulted, but engaged in the design and in identifying the issues. And certainly, you know, where we work, the teams that we work with are doing consultations, but they're also working hand in hand with beneficiaries, and so really help to inform and design that. one core challenge is that to do a robust gender analysis takes some time, and it might actually take some funds. And so that is not part of the funded process for donor applications. And further to that, sometimes the call for applications is quite short. And that makes it really difficult to actually start a design process. So really you're looking at, where you have been engaging with communities and beneficiaries over the long term. For us, that's possible in many ways, but if we want to engage on new areas of work and certainly delve further into some of these more complex issues like gender equality, that requires really good knowledge and understanding of the local context, it does require that we have time and support for really doing a robust gender analysis. So certainly it's important to be asking the partners and holding them to doing that, but it's also important for the donor to think about how that they're going to support that process as well. And that's a system, I think, that hasn't really adapted in the wake of new policies in the same way. But it's certainly fundamentally important. You may want to respond to that.
I don't think you need to. So yeah, no, I completely agree. And just I want to elaborate a little bit on culture, which maybe nobody mentioned, but I think we were all thinking about culture when we said context. And the example, just to illustrate that, is in one of the GROW research projects where in South Asia, where one of the issues was women's labor force participation. Women's labor force participation in South Asia has been going down. And in this particular context, one of the research projects partly looked at the reasons, and what we found there is that yes, culture is really important because men work and women are supposed to stay at home, but that was much more complex as well. So one thing we found was that the decline of women's labor force participation was partly possibly because the situation was getting slightly better. This was women that working for 12 hours, the example you were giving, and women working 12, 15 hours breaking stones in 40 degrees. When the family situation got slightly better, women withdraw from the labor market. Now, the gender norms are still there. We might want to change that, but this was still overall a positive thing, and the choice there. The other part of that, and this part of the research project, was about what about the provision of childcare, and the women there actually said to slightly exaggerate the point is like, no, don't worry about childcare. What we need is roads. What we need is water supply, so the time that we need to get the water and to get to the hospital and so on would be decreased, and we will take care of the children, right? And the overall finding from GROW was like, providing childcare is really, really important. It can be a great contribution, but doesn't mean that therefore it's the right intervention everywhere.
Rebecca?
Great, thank you. Nice thing about Zoom is I've been listening in this whole time. I couldn't come right away, and it went great on Zoom as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for that opportunity. That was really, really good. So my question is about this other element of measurement that I think is really interesting, and I'm not sure if it's being covered much or to what extent it's of interest. And that is what Frary calls the animators, and that sort of, if we're striving for empowerment, we're looking for that conscientization model, we're looking for praxis. I'm wondering, who are the animators in that process? So who are the individuals that are making the distinctive contributions to women's economic empowerment? And if there's some interesting research around that. And I really think that international volunteers are doing an enormous amount of this work around building opportunities and relationships that promote empowerment. So I was just wondering if anybody's been doing research on this and if this is something that's of interest, because I think insider activists, I think international volunteers, and there are other like local women's organizations, I think measuring their contribution to women's empowerment would be a really interesting focus for future research.
That's an excellent suggestion. I don't know if anybody has any input on the panel. Yeah. Yeah.
I could add to just one. Yeah. definitely important. Certainly there is research on the impact of local women's organizations and women's rights organizations and really moving the needle on gender equality and women's empowerment. And certainly there are also really great interventions on change agents within communities, and how they are able, and so change agents could be, a whole bunch of individuals who are different types of programming who are doing different kinds of activities. So it could be delivering a service and then also talking about social norms, for example, or it could be individuals in the community who already have influence who are then engaged in a program. So for example, in some of our programs, we have community advisory boards. So those are already influencers in the community that we then engage to try to have them come up with gender issues that need to be addressed in their community and take those on. And that has much more weight than, for example, if I come in and say, you should talk about these gender issues, and certainly is much more effective. So in terms of research on that, I mean, we certainly have the evaluations from programs, but I haven't seen any specific research except for on male change agents in engaging men programming, and there's some really great stuff that's been done in Rwanda, Burundi, and a few other places as well.
Thank you. My name is Kais Riani. I am an independent consultant and currently working for the University of Ottawa. So my question is, apart from the challenges in developing the models for monitoring and evaluation, I would like you to, probably Lindsay could give us some more, from my experience, the challenge is not in the design of the models, it's rather in the implementation. And the more complicated the models are, the more challenging it's to implement, and the results will not necessarily be better if we have more sophisticated models. So maybe with global affairs, I agree, we need to keep things simple so we can understand, but also these complicated models do not necessarily mean that we know better. Thank you.
Yes. So, certainly there's a, so if we're talking specifically around measurement, from my experience as a gender advisor, I often think about a number of factors that are going to influence not only the quality of the information that we are able to gather, but also the experience of the person who is the respondent, right? And so the participant in that study. We have a lot of things that we need to think about, and their time is one of them. And that's certainly something that becomes really complicated and challenging the more questions and the more issues we try to get at. It also is something we need to think about in terms of the kinds of topics that we're focusing on and how those can be quite sensitive in any context. If somebody came to my house and started asking me some of these kinds of questions, I might think twice about answering them myself. And so I think it's something we need to think about as program implementers is, what do we actually need to know? And who do we need to get that information from? And how do we get that information? We need to think about that really critically, not just from what we need, but also from why should anybody participate in this, right? And so what are the benefits to them? But further to that, what kind of constraints are we placing on them? And just like we would think about in our programming in terms of things like childcare support for an individual who's coming to a training, or providing, compensation of some kind, and that's a hot topic in research. Do we do that or do we not? It is their time. That is productive work time. So, there's a number of things to think about in that sense. On the programming side, from the sort of theory of change to practice issue, one of the big challenges is actually making sure that people on the team fully understand the theory of change and why we're doing what we're doing. Because there are many times as implementers where, we might have some nice ideas and some beautiful theories, and then on the ground, the team may say, oh, we have no idea why we're doing X, Y, or Z, but, so we're just going to keep doing the things we've been doing. And, and so really engaging our teams, but also our beneficiaries from the beginning for them to help design really not only gives ownership, but it also makes sure that we're all on the same page. And that's really important. We've certainly had programs where we've come down the line and said, okay, so this beautiful idea we had in practice looks like the same thing we did last project. So something's missing, right? And a lot of that really is that dialogue and that relationship building and that understanding. And so, yeah, it can be quite complex. It's not that can't be complex. It's that we then have to say practically which elements of this complex theory are we implementing and why, and which ones are being implemented by others or that are part of a longer term path that we're going to take. So really being strategic and also communicating that and sharing those decisions, you know, with the teams and with the communities where we work.
Add one thing to it. You're absolutely right. A good, you know, the fancy theory doesn't give you better information than simple measures, right? But even simple measures don't necessarily give you the right info. No, seriously. When Sonia mentioned the T4 form and said that shows you how much income there was, even that is not true, right? Yeah. Not necessarily. That is very much. There can be all sorts of reasons. One's expenses in not in there, right? It depends. And the important. I'm not making any suggestions here. I'll be very clear about it. But the important thing is it depends on the quality of the recording on that T4 form. So what is really important in all those contexts, even very simple measures, in very varied and complex contexts, it really, when I think about good enumerators that have, you know, there's an art to asking difficult questions that's based in understanding the local context, because in the end, and I've done life histories and think about how you write up life histories. It's like it's a complete chaos in the way that people tell stories, and still you write down a record that in that case was relevant for my PhD. It's the quality of that recording and therefore the capacity of the people on the ground that is absolutely critical.
I'll go back to it's all really interesting for me to hear that. I'll go back to the simple fact that we donors are really, really simple. Ultimately, the question, I think, is to know, are we happy with the results of a project? It's very difficult to get to an answer, to have a straight answer to this question. When you spend $10, $5, $20 million on a project, it's money that comes from, you know, taxpayers, from Canadians, from us, but also from the lady who works, you know, at night, you know, at Walmart, or you know, doing barely a bit above minimum wage, perhaps. And a part of her taxes go to a foreign country, and they go there with the hope of effectuating a change. So that's important. So the question is, okay, are we, with all these resources that are involved in this project, first, would it have been just better simply providing the money directly to the recipients? That perhaps in some cases, frankly. In some other cases, are we satisfied that this money did the best, that we had the best outcome possible? I think it's, you know, it's an ethical question. So when are we satisfied with these questions? When is it that a change in a WEA index, for example, if it changes by 2 deciles, are we happy? It's difficult to answer these questions. At the moment, unfortunately, because of the diversity of measurement, it's very hard for us to come up with a real satisfactory answer in many cases. So it's important for us to go back to the basics, I think, and say, okay, when are we satisfied that this money did had the best outcome possible, and change something for these women, for the ultimate beneficiaries, and actually reduce poverty, because ultimately that's what it's all about.
We're running out of time. We have 2 more questions, so maybe we can take them in sequence and then have the response. Is that okay? So you, and then, yeah. It's great, actually, because your comment just leads right into what I was thinking through. And, you know, one common theme that I think has come out of all of this is that this type of measurement is very context specific. That's one thing that's, you know, kind of an absolute. And we're finding more and more that
donors are very, very conscious. Oh, first of all, my name's Marisa. I work with Agri-Team Canada, and I've worked a lot in multi-donor contexts where multiple donors are funding projects. And it becomes, I mean, if this is complicated, I mean, that becomes, you know, exponentially more complicated, because you want to keep donors working together in a coordinated mechanism, for instance, but you want to satisfy them and their governments and their parliaments as to the proper usage of the funding. And it's not just satisfying them, but satisfying them also that the results are actually demonstrable and that you are having an impact on the ground. So I guess, you know, and this goes back to a little bit what Arian was saying about the Sustainable Development Goals, and to what extent we can use and leverage the Sustainable Development Goals to tie together the results, the types of results, the types of measurement that different European donors in particular, because they tend to work together a fair bit, but Canada also joins in with these initiatives, the Americans not so much. But, you know, how can we look at the bigger picture? Can the SDGs provide a type of a tool for us to work through? And, you know, I mean, personally, I think Canada is perfectly situated to take a leadership role on this, with all of the investment that has been made in academia, through global affairs, with the FIAP, and the amount of impetus and experience that we've gained over the last 4 years of the FIAP. So I don't know if there's a clear question coming out of all of that blah blah, because it can.
Okay, I also realize that we are completely out of time, and I know that some of our panelists have to leave. So it may be very. There was one last question. Yep.
Very quickly. Hi, my name is Kathy Clare. I work with groups of women in Tanzania and the DR Congo. And I was interested, Lindsay, when you mentioned that CARE was doing some work around tools where you asked the beneficiaries to define what women's empowerment is. And one of the things that I wanted to maybe comment on was, in my experience, it takes a great deal of time in speaking to a woman or anyone to build a relationship of trust before she's going to tell you what her definition of empowerment is. More likely, she's going to tell you what your definition of empowerment is in order that she's going to receive the economic benefit of that particular project. And, you know, it can take years before, and trust built, and exchanging of resources and sharing before you can have that kind of honest discussion with that woman, where then you can get to that place where you're able to understand what it is she feels empowerment would be for her. And I just was interested in anyone's comment, and or just to make that comment myself. Thank you for taking the time for me.
Thank you. I really wish we had more time, because I know I see a lot of feeling of wanting to participate from around the room, and I'm sure that people also on Zoom would have liked to have participated as well. We do have to end it here, so I'd like to first of all thank all of you for coming and participating either in person or bearing with us online. This is just our first seminar like this. We're going to have more. Our next one is scheduled on Thursday, May 23rd. Kate Grantham, who you all know, who's been whose amazing work today would not have happened at all. Feminist and gender transformative approaches to financial inclusion. So stay tuned for more information about that. And I would also very much like to wrap up by thanking both SSHRC and IDRC for this, and especially our panelists, François Philippe, Ariane, and Lindsay, for an amazing roundtable conversation. So thank you very much, and see you next month.